Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this CALT Kōrero discussion panel. This session will be about assessment, and my name is Nave Wald, and I from the Higher Education Development Center, and I will be facilitating this panel discussion. We look at assessment now and in the future because assessment is a major driving factor for students' behavior and learning, and also has a big impact on our teaching and curriculum design. We will be taking questions from the audience here in the studio and for those watching us online, so by all means send your questions through and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of this session. Joining me, a panel of fellow academics from the university, and I'll hand it over to them to introduce themselves.
Kia ora, I'm Simone Marshall. I'm Professor of Medieval Literature in the English program, and I'm particularly interested in experiential learning.
Kia ora, my name's Blair Blakie. I'm a professor in the physics department. I'm quite passionate about the challenges of education in physics, and I really like problem-based learning.
Kia ora, I'm Angela Clark from the Faculty of Dentistry, and I convened the Forensic Biology Summer School paper, and I'm interested in assessments that are grounded in real-life scenarios.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. Assessment is a big issue and a big topic, and we can't possibly cover every aspect of it, but we'll try to raise a number of issues today and then take questions. Assessment has a number of different purposes of functions, but based on your experience and your teaching philosophy, if you like, what are the key objectives that you have in mind when you assess student learning?
Well, if I can use an example that I use in my own teaching, I teach medieval literature. In English literature, we often use essays as a means of assessment, and they are great. They help to show students understanding of critical thinking. They get to use and demonstrate their critical thinking, and really show how they can apply the knowledge that they've gained earlier. But when I'm teaching medieval literature, I also want them to be able to show that they understand the context in which the literature has come from. So what I do is I take my students to the Dunedin Public Library. So this is my wee plug. I like to mention that Dunedin has the largest collection of medieval manuscripts in the Southern Hemisphere. So I take my students to have a look at these, and it's thrilling and exciting, and the students get to handle 1,000-year-old books, which they can't quite believe. But then I use that as part of their assessment. They have to make a book and then write an analysis of how making a book using those techniques then impacts on the meaning of the texts that they're using. So I try to make the assessment interesting and relevant to them by making it practical and hands-on.
Okay. Blair, what are some of the key objectives you have in mind?
Yeah, so something about physics, we have the saying, which is that physics is not a spectator sport. And so we really expect the students learning not just to learn the ideas, but to be able to apply them to lots of different situations. And that's quite challenging because our theories are very formal, and often the ways of solving problems are quite technical. And so I like to have a bit of an analogy that I think it's like a musician trying to learn to play a complex passage of music, that a lot of practice is needed to master those things. And so very similarly in physics, we often in many of our papers will have weekly assignments so that they're forced to apply or encouraged to apply those ideas to new problems regularly. And as part of that, in applying it to the new problems, they can see maybe the simplicity of the idea will emerge. And I think often you get that by trying to do it yourself. Even though there's quite high workload and assignments, we give a lot of support to the students. So I think the students can come and ask us for as much help as they want. And I'd like to think that in the internal assessment, our students could often get almost perfect grades. But on the other side, we have again, using the music analogy, the concert at the end, which is the exam. And so they have to use that internal assessment to build up the skills to actually deliver on the day and show that they can apply those ideas in the final exam.
Okay. Angela, objectives in student assessment?
Yeah, in summer school it's quite different. We have a lot of students that come from a diverse range of backgrounds from across the university. So the assessments that I've developed over the years are really about critical thinking or forensic thinking, because to be a forensic scientist is to be a critical thinker and a lateral thinker. And what the students do is very much like Simone was saying, they work together in teams, or like a CSI TV show, and they get dressed up in their full white gowns, and they use real forensic tools and techniques to analyse a mock crime scene. And that provides them with a really practical way of applying their knowledge in that situation. And they're not per se directly assessed on what the outcomes are, what they found, but they learn to think critically, and week by week we do a little bit more of that analysis, and by the end of it they've learned how to think. And then in the final assessment they are actually tested on that process of thinking rather than anything that they've directly learned or done during that practical session.
So you all of you mentioned a number of issues around innovation and different types of assessment. What are your experiences around how students perceive and accept those? Because sometimes students need to juggle quite a lot of assessments at the same time.
Yeah.
This is something that I think struck me, and often in a subject like physics, my experience of coming through as being a student might be quite different from an average student. And I had a recent experience where I took a paper in a discipline. I became a student again. I learned a Māori paper. And as a novice and a non-expert at that subject, it gave me a new awareness of how challenging even quite simple assignments can be. Yeah. And I remember there was one assignment pronouncing some place names. If you're an expert, you think they'll take 5 minutes to record yourself doing this, but as a non-expert, half a day disappeared. And that made me reflect on how I set assignments for my students. And I think it's a really valuable process for us to go through, is taking a step back from where we're expert and maybe appreciating some of the challenges students will have.
Yeah, I've gained a similar appreciation. I've just started the Māori Society paper this semester, and I feel exactly the same way. It's like, this is such a good experience to be a student again, to understand how and have that empathy for what our students are experiencing. It's been one of the best kind of learning journeys that I've been on to inform my teaching too.
I was thinking about how with the example that I gave, that type of assessment, how often the students are really uncomfortable with that to start with. It's not what they expect an assessment task should be. In English, they do expect to write essays, and we do it a lot, but suddenly you can bring out something else, and it takes a lot of explanation to say why it's still a valid assessment task and how they're going to learn from it. What I tend to do is go back to what are the learning outcomes, explain it to the students. This is what I want you to have understood or learned or gained as a skill, perhaps at the end of this activity, and suddenly they get it. They're fine. They understand completely why they're doing it then, but they need that explanation, that preparation beforehand, I find.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we do the same in the forensic summer school. They have an essay, which for the majority of students, although we are really broad in where our students come from, they do come from the Division of Health Sciences, and essays are quite unfamiliar to them.
Yes.
And they do need that. They need the reassurance of what is expected of them without laying it out and giving them a list of bullet points to follow, or a scripted example. But given the confidence as well, I found, giving the students the confidence in terms of setting out those clear expectations of what is actually required of them. And our essay is actually a reflective essay assignment, and getting students to understand that it's not a matter of just regurgitating a specific science, but it's actually their own opinion matters, and giving the students that authority for their own learning and education, I think, and they find it from thinking about how we know it works. The students really feedback very positively about an essay. And although at the beginning of the semester they might moan and groan that that's what they have to do, on student evaluations I've had comments going, the essay is been the highlight of the course, you know, and it's like, well, when is an assessment the highlight of the course? I must be doing something right here. So yeah, I mean, it's good to get that validation.
Yeah, and even in a subject like physics, beyond those standard assignments, we've had more innovations, and so now in some of our papers, you'll develop and present posters, give presentations, write a mock journal article, and this, for our students, they feel quite uncomfortable doing that. So yes, motivating it to them, and also telling them things like what we hear from graduates afterwards about the skills they wish they had more of.
Yes.
And I think those things are really important. But of course, it makes students a little bit uncomfortable, and it's up to us to help them understand why we're doing it.
Absolutely. And giving them some feedback from professionals as well. So not only recent graduates, but then people that are the employers for those people. What do they actually want in their new recruits coming through? I think it's really valuable. And if you can show the students that these are the skills that employers actually need in you, and this is why this assessment is trying to help you achieve that skill, it kind of just makes sense in some way.
We have a similar scenario with some of our more senior students, postgraduate honours level, where we might get them to do things like write a research essay and present a poster and give a presentation or something like that, where it's almost like vocational training if they're looking at an academic career. And you know, they've never done this sort of thing before, but they suddenly realise, okay, this is actually what you do to become a lecturer, potentially. And it makes sense to them. They see why they're doing it then, and they go with the feeling of uncomfortableness.
So I think that the message, kind of, what my understanding is that we as teachers needs to know why we assess in the way we do. We need a variety of assessment tasks, so we make sure that we cover knowledge as well as many different skills, communication skills and technical skills, and convey those to students. Be upfront and explain and get a buy-in from the students, and don't just assume that students know why an essay is important or a lab report is important or calculations are important. We need to spell it out and get them on board.
And I think it's really great to be bold and try some new things. And sometimes we can just get stuck into a pattern, but it is nice to try things and look to see what colleagues are doing in different areas.
Absolutely. I mean, I do always keep coming back to my learning outcomes for a particular class, but try to look at it afresh, so that I think, well, this is a learning outcome I think is important. What can we do to get to that learning outcome? And suddenly the world opens, and you can realise you can do anything. You've got a particular space you've got to teach in. We often don't get to determine that. But within that space, you can do whatever it takes to get your students to achieve that learning outcome. If it means you have to stand on a table and get them to do a tap dance or something, if that achieves the learning outcome, then it's absolutely fine. And I quite like starting from that point of view, where everything is possible for a moment there, and then you start to sort of narrow it down, and it allows you to be innovative.
Absolutely.
Let's move a little bit towards kind of identify some challenges in terms of assessment and assessing student work. I mean, there are many different challenges, and you can raise the ones you think are important. But one challenge is around feedback, I think so, and around innovation too. So we hear from some colleagues that it's risky to innovate. It's risky to try new things. There might be kind of a pushback from students. What are kind of your views around that perceived risk in teaching? And some colleagues may be risk averse and say, well, I'm not going to try that. Are there any strategies or thoughts around that advice?
I often like, when we look at the change that's happened in our department, actually often it's come from people who've come from outside and they've seen different things, they do it, and they show to other staff that it can work and students enjoy it. And I think that's often a really good way to allow change to happen. And when you have new staff coming in who do have new ideas, we should foster that, we should encourage them, we shouldn't try to say, no, it's always been done this way. And I think it's good to have a culture in your area where you are open to new things and innovation. And there's always a risk with this, but I think if we support our colleagues to do that, it's going to be a good thing.
We've had, in the humanities over the past few years, teaching circles, which has been managed and looked after by HEDC, which is wonderful. And it's a very informal scenario where academics who volunteer because they're interested get together every so often, if every week or 2 weeks or a month, for a cup of coffee and just talk about their teaching to each other. Just share ideas. Say, well, I did this week, it worked really well, or it didn't work very well, and just to share ideas. And I think that achieves the same thing that you're talking about, Blair, that you start to hear what other people are doing elsewhere and realise, oh, I could do that in my teaching. That might be interesting.
Yeah.
I think we tend to do that more around research rather than around teaching.
That's right. Yeah.
That's part of the idea of having this forum here, also to raise that possibility of also talking about teaching.
Yeah.
I had a person tell me some years ago that in our research we're really quite happy if we have problems, because that's what we investigate. We like to research problems and come up with solutions or responses to those problems, and we forget that it's also okay to have problems in our teaching, which you then investigate and engage with and come up with solutions to. And I quite like that idea. It reminds you that it's okay to have problems and discuss them with others and come up with new ideas from them.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the major issues I guess we've been facing over increasingly over the last few years is dealing with student pastoral care in our studies, and so we've been dealing with that increasing challenge over the years, and it's been interesting of the developments that have been made to foster that within the teaching staff, and I think it's about learning again going back to that point that you made, Blair, around learning the challenges students are facing, whether that be with what they're doing in the teaching environment or what challenges they have outside in the big wide world as well. And I think the more empathy that we can have as teachers, the more that we reflect on what we're doing and how we're teaching, creates a better, more supportive learning environment. And, we can only do our best and just make small improvements year on year when we're doing that. And I guess feedback is crucial and discussion is crucial to those improvements.
Something I've found quite useful in our department is often after an examiner's meeting at the end of semester, you're very acutely aware of how your paper went, how they went in the exam. And of course, by the time the next year rolls around, you've forgotten it all. But that's actually the time to have a good discussion with other, like in some of our larger courses where it's team talk, discuss then, like, what should we do differently? And don't be scared to try. If something's occurred twice in a row and you think, no, that's not working, let's change it. And that's actually the best time to try and do it, because you're fully aware of how it's gone. And it's quite easy to think at that point, oh, well, got through it, pack it away until next year. But actually that's the right time to be thinking about changes.
Yeah. In my field, I'm quite fortunate that a lot of guest lecturers during the summer school are actually professional experts in the field around New Zealand, and I often have discussions with them. Two of them are actually teachers at the police college in Wellington, so they train all our forensic scientists coming out of the police force, and they are hands-on teaching during the summer course as well, and I often do that as soon as kind of we've done our tutorial. We sit down and go, right, what do we need to do for next year, and have that immediate discussion and make those plans right there and then. And I find it really invaluable to have not just that discussion with other teachers, but from people doing that in real life, going, well, that's not actually a real thing that might happen. You might need to tweak that. That's slightly like CSI TV, not actually real life. And so, making improvements all the time.
Fantastic.
Are there any other kind of challenges you came across in terms of assessment and well-being of students, final exams, stress?
So one small innovation I made, and I talked at the start about some of our courses where they have these weekly assignments. And I'm also mindful that if you're a physics student, you're probably taking other physics papers which have weekly assignments. You're probably taking math papers that have weekly assignments. And so on my reflection from taking my Māori language paper, what I decided to do was sort of alternate between a normal sort of written assignment and something that was a bit lighter, which gave them a chance to practice, but maybe is more like a blackboard quiz where they could have multiple attempts. And it was, as I say, a chance to practice, but it wasn't overbearing. And so the idea is that they're not going to have a high workload every week, but we're still encouraging them to do things.
What do you think about the possibility of having something like that, assessment that is not summative, so there are no marks involved, only formative for the students? Have you tried that, or how do you think that might be perceived by students?
Well, there's certainly something we use. So we also have a weekly problem-solving session where the students come along and might spend 2 hours doing problems where we don't check that they're right at the end, but we're going around and making sure they're doing and practicing the things. And yes, you might say they're getting their assessment for participating in this, and it's our job to make sure they're learning in this. But they can do it without worried about getting everything right or presenting everything. It's a good chance to have a practice run.
We do something similar in some of our papers where we know we've given them an assessment task that is new to them and they will have never done it before and they're nervous. So we do a kind of mock run of it in a tutorial class where we say, okay, here's the same scenario. It's slightly different, so you're not actually just going to repeat the task, but it gives them the confidence to then do the task themselves. So there is no, it's not a formal piece of assessment, there is no grade for it, but it prepares them for the assessment task itself.
Yeah, I've done something similar in one of my third year teaching where their final summative assessment is part of a research presentation that they have to perform as a group. But in the previous tutorial session, they have to provide a formative assessment on another topic, presenting on another topic that's kind of related. But what the key thing is from that formative assessment is my feedback. And so that's what I spend most of my time doing during that tutorial, is that they're talking and I'm writing extremely detailed feedback for them that they then get immediately to then use to improve their summative final performance, if you like, in their presentation. But they also get not just my mark, but a peer review of within each other, within their team, and also a self-reflection. And so there's 3 parts to actually that assessment where they get graded. So it's self, team, and then an external opinion from myself. And that's worked really well for that kind of higher third year level.
I think this is a real challenge, and I said at the beginning that assessment drives student behavior and learning, and sometimes in a good way and sometimes not in the best of ways. And I think there is an expectation by most students that every piece of assessment will be graded. And that's something that historically wasn't always the case, and it's still not always the case, but there's that expectation, I think, is there. And for me, part of the challenge is how can we develop innovative ways of assessing where students, there's a buy-in and they put the effort in, but without grading everything. So there's more learning and less grading.
It's a challenge because, you know, we can be as innovative as we like and we can come up with all sorts of different ways of teaching our students, teaching them to think, but the bottom line is we have to give them a mark at the end of the semester. That there is no, that is the constraint that we all work under. So we have to come up with that, and so that will always be the students' sort of main factor in the back of their mind. So I think they always need to see that whatever they're doing in their course is leading to that final grade, that it's not irrelevant or unconnected. So I think whether it's formative or summative within your paper, if the students know that it does ultimately have an impact on their final mark, then I think that really helps them, and they understand that too.
I think particularly through the NCA system, the assessment is the currency for the students, and it's how we tell them something's important by saying it is this percentage of your final, and if there is no percentage on it, then maybe the signal to many students is it isn't important. So it is a difficult balance to obtain, and and we're in a complex environment with new technologies emerging, and so that also makes some of these assessments now difficult to deliver, and then there's a lot of weight it carries in their final grade, and these are issues we have to think carefully about as well.
But I think making this, student expectations, I think making those clear at the beginning of your teaching is paramount to getting engagement with the students. If they understand what's being asked of them and why and how it's going to help them. I mean, I've never had an issue with assessments being done, whether formative or summative, if those expectations are clearly laid out to them. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any kind of challenges that you would like to kind of highlight, something you find challenging in relating to assessment, maybe in your own discipline, or any other kind of challenges that you would like to discuss with us?
So I could maybe talk about some evolution we've had in particularly our first year teaching, where in our final exams we have gone from a sort of mixed 50% long answer, 50% multi-choice. And over some period of time, we looked at that as a summative form of assessment, and the correlation between how students did in those two sections was essentially perfect. So we weren't learning more about their abilities from the long answer questions than the multi-choice. And so, of course, we then decided to go down the path of why don't we make our exams fully multi-choice? And we've operated that way for some period of time. But now, maybe in the last few years, we started to question, when we see those students coming into second year, maybe they haven't got the skills in writing well-formed answers to problems. And so we're beginning to think, well, maybe it's not just about the summative assessment. Maybe by us saying we have long answers in our first year papers, we're also giving some importance to that skill to the students. And so now we're beginning the pendulum swinging back the other way a little bit. We're seeing, let's put some long answers back, and do we see the difference in the students in second year? So that's just one of those things that sort of crops up and evolves over time.
We mentioned feedback, and so part of the challenge perhaps is time, is for us teachers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So any kind, what are your experiences with the time we need to kind of devote to assessment?
Have a very clear and defined grading rubric is essential for students and also essential for the teachers grading the assignments. And I think that's really helped, especially when, you know, our biggest class size over summer has been 196 students in a 6-week period. So almost
intense.
200 essays to mark within a week to 10 days. That was quite a lot of work. But that having a very clear rubric allowed the teaching team to really assess on the same level. You know, you've got to spread the load. So the quality of our teaching of our assessment feedback was all the same, and that we were able to devote enough time to each and every student assessment because we had a very clear grading rubric. So that's one thing that we've found that's really helped provide the feedback to the students.
I had an interesting experience some years ago where a student had submitted an essay, and I had written a lot of feedback on it. There were lots of, it was a great essay, there were lots of things to say, and I wrote all over this essay, and I remember thinking, oh, this is great, the student's going to gain so much from this feedback. And the reality was the student was really overwhelmed by it, and was quite, not upset, but confused by it all, because there was so much feedback. And I often go back to that example and remind myself that more feedback isn't always better feedback, that I'd probably given too much. And so I think, you know, in a similar assessment task today, I would be limiting how much feedback I give, not because I don't want to, but because I know that they're not always going to benefit from too much of it. So just, you know, the rubric keeps you on track, doesn't
absolutely.
it?
Yeah, so I think to give good feedback, and in my discipline, particularly in finding errors and derivations or in lab reports, it's actually can be very time consuming to see where they've gone wrong if it's something detailed, but also in lab reports maybe a bit more like something like an essay. It's very time consuming to give good, clear feedback, and sometimes you feel like the students don't pick up on all of that. They're more worried about the grade they got than the feedback, but it's important it's there often in setting what we're expecting.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always direct the students to the online feedback. Yes, you've got your grade, but, you know, go back to the essay, you know, and just remind the students of that exact thing. We have read it, you know, we haven't just arbitrarily picked a grade out of the sky and given it to you, you know, and we really care about improving you as a human being, and that's why we're teachers, you know, and that's why, you know, we like teaching. And so I encourage students to go to that feedback and really take note of it, and hopefully that they can use it for future assignments.
I want to kind of touch briefly on the Blair mentioned the final exam. It's a contentious kind of issues, and perhaps we've seen some trends, and with the pandemic, there are some different views whether the final exam is a good thing, is a bad thing. It should be bigger, it should be smaller, it should only first year, never postgraduate level. What are your kind of thoughts in terms of the final exam, in terms of its objectives and issues around that?
Well, maybe I can start as some extreme view. I think, as I said, often in many of our subjects, we give the students as much help as they need to learn these skills. We even encourage them to work together. And, you know, that could lead one to worry about integrity of all the results you're seeing on the way through. And so having a final exam, an invigilated final exam, is really a way to ensure, you know, if we're giving them a grade, that's reflecting what they're capable of. And indeed, we often have minimum exam marks. So even if their internal is quite high, you must score, let's say, 30% in the final to pass. And that really gives the motivation to the students. They have to learn. Yes, you get as much help, but you have to be able to do it. On the other hand, we've all met students who fall to pieces in exams. And you know that you're not getting a reflection of who they are. And so that's this balancing, and I don't know the best solution for this.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think in my field, we've probably started to move away more and more from exams, because in our field we feel like, why is a particular time constraint a good measure of whether they've understood a particular subject area and demonstrated they can apply it? So we do have perhaps a lot more internal assessment tasks where they have that opportunity. But on the other hand, I come back to what you said there, Blair, that it may well be the one piece of assessment where, because it's invigilated, we know it is the student's own work for certain. So I think it has its place. On a really pragmatic level, in a very large class, it's a managerial kind of issue. It's very hard to assess hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students quickly and efficiently, but an exam does do that. Sometimes we are in those positions, and we really need to be able to do that. So making those exams then really effective as summative assessment is really important.
Yeah, I think I found with our final exam over the past couple of years, especially during COVID, when we made things open book, I kind of changed the exam structure to be focused on quality rather than quantity. So I reduced both the number of questions for short answer, reduced the number of topics covered within the exam, and then focused just on 2 long answer questions and and a couple of short answer questions to really help the students focus. And instead of them, they were telling me they were just so overwhelmed. They've done all of this stuff in the last 6 weeks. It's so much to revise when they have basically 4 days between the end of semester and when their exam is. And so I heard them and really just peeled it back. And I was a bit worried at the time, announcing to them, well, this lecture's not going to be in the exam, and then walk into an empty lecture theatre. But thankfully that didn't happen, and they still attended the course as usual. And so I'm not afraid of saying that anymore. And I'm not afraid of standing up in the front of the lecture going, just listen to me. You don't have to learn everything I'm saying. You're not going to be directly assessed on the content today, but this is really useful and key information to your holistic understanding, I guess. And that's really improved teaching and improved student experiences, that you don't have to assess everything. And it goes back to, I guess, what Simone opened with, which is like, our key really is you go back to those learning objectives, those learning outcomes. It's about how you want them to learn, not necessarily what you need them to learn. But of course that depends entirely on the subject area as well.
That's true.
But,
When speculating a bit about the new future, do you think that the AI technology that we can't completely ignore here, do you think that might have any effect on essays, on maybe final exams will make a bit of a comeback because it's a safe assessment environment? What are your thoughts, concerns, or maybe if you can share if you had any conversations with colleagues in the department?
I feel like it's certainly some of the discussions of us moving to more online exams seem to have reversed as this technology's come out. And I think we're really struggling to know what the future's going to look like. So I won't try and predict what's going to happen, but I also have some faith that particularly at higher levels, our students, they generally have a lot of integrity. When we put them under too much pressure and they've got too much workload, they might sometimes make use of things they shouldn't. And so I think it's partly we've got to understand what we're requiring of them. But I think as we get to second and third year students, I'm hopeful this won't be a huge problem.
Yeah, I think I the first thing I did when I heard about all the AI platforms online was write in my essay question and my task and to see what the outcome was. And with our reflective essay assignments, the the creative part of the essay was done by AI beautifully, really well. But what is really key about our assignment is personal reflection. And that's something that the AI models could try to generate for you. But I'm hopeful that next year when we come back to this, is that we will be able to tell, or that we change the way that we have that grading rubric to assess specific parts of that reflection to acknowledge what the student's actually saying rather than a computer generated. But as Blair said, we can't know what the future really is like at the moment, unfortunately.
It is interesting that the examples that we've each given of our assessment are ones that actually wouldn't be easily reproducible by AI. They're practical involvement and actually doing tasks that you then need to see what the student has learned from them. That's very hard to replicate. So it could well be that we start doing more of these sorts of things. And yes, maybe we'll do more exams or presentations. Again, are another thing that are difficult to do anything other than just stand up and do them. So maybe we will see more of that. But I suspect we will all accommodate this as time goes by. I don't know if I'm being naive here, but I look at our maths department and they still exist despite the invention of calculators, and they're fine. And I suspect that this will be the case with AI, or I hope so. Maybe I'm naive.
Yeah, I agree. I think we like to see these doomsday scenarios, whether it's various things have come up in history and that was the end of higher education, and it hasn't happened. And I think really important thing we do is we create an interesting learning environment, and of course there'll be evolution. We will evolve, and we just have to keep our eyes open to what the best thing to do is.
Yeah.
Okay. On this positive note, let's pass it on for some questions from the audience here in the studio or online. If you have any questions or issues or things you would like to ask or ask the panel members to discuss. Yes.
Kia ora, thank you for your kōrero. I have a question for you all about if, I guess, assessment wasn't a factor and funding wasn't a factor, what would be one of your big dream assignments or lecture workshop opportunities in your respective fields? Something kind of out of the box that you think would be really fun to try.
That's a good question. I'm happy to speak first. I kind of partly doing that. I'm quite excited by your question because I'm like, yeah, I actually get to do that. But what I would do is make it more focused on my own expertise, which is forensic anthropology. So I look at human skeletal remains, and I'd love to run some form of methodology interactive course where we would actually go into an area and do some practical work. I mean, a lot of forensic science is not, well, a lot of forensic science is in the lab. My kind of forensic science is out in the field. So that's what I'd love to do is really do some simulated real life experiences for students. That's where for me, that's where the real learning takes place. Mm.
So I think in my area, maybe to let things be more project driven and research like, so going beyond the basics, we can teach them, take them into the labs to follow up with experiments, which are not just one-off things, but things you can come back to every week and advance some more and more. Mm-hmm. So something like that I think is a great learning opportunity, not really compatible with how our lower level courses are, but to really, I mean, I do like those ideas of self-driven student activities where they can take it and advance it themselves. I think that's where you really get the knowledge and embed it.
Yeah. And my field, again, a bit like you, Angela, that I kind of am already doing that by getting my students to make a book. It's very exciting. I think it's thrilling. But I'm also aware that they get the very bare minimum at the moment because of the constraints of how our semesters are designed, and we have to work within that. It would be great to be able to do more than that. You know, when I have my students looking at a medieval book, they don't get to learn the language with me because there just isn't time. I would love to be able to teach them the range of different early medieval languages that they could be using when they're looking at these texts. There is an entire field of paleography, handwriting analysis, which I occasionally get to teach with the odd person who wants to do this, but usually that's in my own time because it doesn't really fit into a university framework easily. It's fascinating, it's thrilling. You know, it really is. It really is that whole. I opened an ancient book and discovered the secret to something magical, and it's marvelous. But it's a time factor actually. Just trying to compress that into a semester is really, really difficult.
Okay, we have a question here from online. So group work and group learning and assessment seems to be increasingly common. How do students learn the boundaries of group learning versus collusion and those types of breaches of academic integrity? So let's talk a little bit about academic integrity.
Challenging.
Maybe I'll start because I don't have much to say on this. I mean, at the moment there's one course I teach with some group work in it, and mainly involves the students solving problems together, then presenting, but they ultimately will independently write something that's assessed. I know when there's more extensive projects and some other things we do in the department, then the group work is a really important part of that, but of course assessing that in a fair way can be quite challenging. I think the students have to learn a lot because they're also learning about the dynamics of a group and things like that. So I always feel with group work, it's one of those tricky things. We should be doing more. Also a little bit scared of how to make it work well.
Yeah, it is difficult because ultimately when we assess students, we have to give each individual a mark. We are constrained by that. But we also know that when we look at, say, the graduate surveys from students, often the feedback will be, you know, those surveys are done a couple of years out from graduation, and they'll often give the feedback of saying, I didn't learn very much group work and I needed it. And they're discovering in the workplace that that's a really valuable skill. So finding the balance where you can actually do that group work in an effective way, but still give students the individual marks that we're obliged to give them is really challenging. I think you're probably doing that already though, Angela.
I think we are, because we don't actually have any assessments in summer school that hinge on the group work. So the group work is as they do it over 5 weeks, and it's a practical aspect that they run with and they work together, and they need to solve the mock mystery over the 6 weeks because they do get asked on whodunit, essentially, in their exam, and provide their own personal interpretations. And they also are asked to reflect on the process of analysing that mock crime scene. And sometimes they will say in their exam answer, well, my group thought this, but I never did. I was always the single voice who thought it was, these people instead. And, and that to me shows great reflection that they've actually not just gone with their group, they've worked with their group, they've understood group dynamics, but they've actually had an independent opinion. So it's just facilitated their learning. So they haven't really, they've learnt the skills around how to work as a team, but yet they haven't been adversely affected. And I think that's one of the things that students worry the most of.
Yes.
And in my third year teaching, where they do have to do the group presentation, the ability to provide team feedback to me that is private to me, that I see, and I ask each individual member to basically give their other teammates a grade themselves. And it's amazing how many times students will actually surprise me, because they will give themselves a lower deserving mark than the other people in their group. And they say, well, actually, I didn't do very much. I didn't attend any of the meetings. They just wrote the script and I read it on the day. And I'm like, wow, that's actually pretty amazing.
That's fascinating, because you think with that it could go the other way, right? And often the students really surprise us. Actually, they're very generous in that way.
So I think having that kind of peer feedback mechanism makes them all just to feel a little bit more comfortable about the fact that if somebody's not pulling their weight in the team, they won't be penalised for it. And I think that's one of the major concerns when you get group assessments.
But would you, for presentation, for example, would you give the same mark? I mean, the marks are individuals, but you can give all students in the group the same mark and avoid that issue in that way, whether or not they contributed to an equivalent level. That's a different question. But would you give them the same mark, or would you differentiate?
But that's why I think Angela's suggestion is really great, because actually something that really upsets students is if someone didn't do anything
and they get the same.
That is something that will really upset students. So I think you've got to have some ability to compensate for that.
When I was a student, I was told that that's life.
That's tricky.
How did you feel about it?
I don't know. Now I think the person who said it might have been right. But certainly there's a degree there of unfairness.
Fairness is a really important factor in designing assessment tasks. The students need to know that they are being assessed fairly, and so I think we can't ignore that in our assessment tasks. I have another little example though with group work, which I've found interesting. I have used group work in my teaching in various times for various tasks, but I very rarely assess it. So the students will have to work in a group to do some particular task, whatever it might be, and then perhaps go and do an assessment task individually, where they get their results. But interestingly, I've made the mistake in the past of not always framing it quite right for them, because they might get to the end of the semester and say, oh, we didn't get to do any group work. And I say, but you were there doing it. I saw you doing it. But of course, they're not registering that because they weren't assessed on it. And it doesn't mean I feel I should have assessed, but I think I should have explained that better, to say, yes, we are doing group work. It is happening right here. These are the skills. But I'm not going to assess you on it.
Well, we found exactly the same thing, where we started innovating, putting some group work in places, and then the feedback at the end, the students don't realise it's group work. And I think you've got to make the point that we are doing this. This is a skill we expect you to get, and we'll not just assume that they will know it.
I think that's one of the worst things you can do with teaching, is make assumptions on what the students understand about what you're doing. I think that's it's really good to just clarify everything and explain it from right on that first lecture.
Any other questions from here, the audience or people online?
We've got one question here.
Hi there. This may not be the right space for it, but just when talking about assessment, what is it you think from the other perspective, that of the lecturers and teachers? Because as you're all saying, you got feedback for your students. In my experiences, there are some lecturers and teachers who totally ignore the assessments that they give to their students. So if the university might administer it at the end of the semester, that could help them continue developing their curriculum and their teaching styles. What are things you would say as far as how teachers are assessed, how lecturers are assessed, that could be changed or improved or have been valuable in the past?
I mean, our HEDC does have some really excellent resources for teachers to help improve teaching. And of course, we all use our teaching and course evaluations, but that's only one source of feedback. It's important. We want to know what our students think. But you can be asking your students throughout the semester, how are things going? You can give informal feedback sessions within a class so that you can make adjustments on the spot. But peer review, having your colleagues come into your class and then have a chat with them afterwards about how did it go? What did this work? Did this not work? I find that personally really, really useful because they're colleagues who know the field, who understand the issues and the things going on. And you can just have a great chat about what things work or don't work or what you can change and improve. So I think recognising that there are a whole range of different ways of getting feedback as a lecturer to improve your teaching, not only the official teaching evaluations, and that using all of them is really useful.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think I see so often the standard teaching evaluations, particularly the free-form comments are the things that often you interpret a lot, and only a small fraction of students provide those, and maybe those often have the strongest opinions. Maybe they really like it, or maybe there's something they really didn't. But those are the things often you really carry away from the standard teaching evaluations. And I think unless your class is extremely large, year on year, those can vary a lot even when the teaching hasn't changed very much. And so there are so many different ways, and often it's really interesting to talk to a student the following year, reflecting back on the whole course, including the things like the exam that are often after the teaching evaluation is taken. So I just think it's always be cautious with any single form of evaluation and interpreting the information.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I receive feedback from both, all of those ways as well. And I think peer review for me has been really helpful. From academics, I'm a little bit of a lone wolf, so I don't have colleagues that have a great understanding of my subject area, so their opinions are really valid for me because they are actually from another area. So it's good to have that outside perspective. And then, this year I've had some formal feedback from some of the expert guests that I bring down to Dunedin to contribute to the paper, and actually had a really good expert professional opinion in terms of what we're doing and whether we can use improvements. And that's actually how much of the course was based, was doing research and I went around the country and did some interviews with experts to formulate, to provide the foundations for the teaching materials. And that really set me in good stead then to actually implement them and then make these minor tweaks year on year based on the huge range of feedback that I gained from what they were doing. But yeah, feedback from all forms is
all sources
essential. Just having those little chats. I'm always available at the end of lectures. And I know it sounds really simple, but spending an extra 15-20 minutes just present in the room where students can just come and talk to you, I find one of the most valuable parts of what I do and informs what I do. Most students will come to you with issues, but I did a brand new lecture this summer and I caveated that to the students. This is something I haven't taught before, and so we'll see how we go. And I had a student come up to me and say that, that was an amazing lecture and they really enjoyed the experience. And it's not often, actually, I think it's not often at all, from my personal experience, that students will actually come up and say that to you. It's more of the negative, critical side, but being receptive to that positive feedback was just as valuable as the critiques. So yeah, it can just all the time, basically. Always questioning, always reflecting on what you're doing. That's the way forward, I think.
I think I would like to echo something Blair said before about making changes when things arise, rather than saying, "Oh, I'll deal with that next year," and then by then, who remembers? I'm trying to sometimes with assignment. For example, we had an assignment now which is writing an essay, but the students we have, many of them colleagues, it may not be as obvious to them what we mean by essay, because they're used to different kind of assessment and writing and so on, and so. Instead of sometimes of explaining this, I can add more information in the course handout in terms of being a little bit more clearer and prevent some of those questions coming in. So I'm using those questions from students about assignments, about the assessment, to improve the communication that I have on that kind of booklet. And I find myself kind of reminding myself I need to do it now when those questions
Yes.
are fresh rather than next year.
I have to admit that I have an open document which is labelled, at the moment, it's labelled 2024. And so as I'm teaching and I finish a class and I go back to my office and I think, right, something worked well or didn't work well or whatever it was, and I put it in the 2024 notes that I look at again when I'm about to teach that paper again, because I will forget otherwise. And then, I have a nice big long list of things for thinking about the following year.
We have time for one last question. Someone online or here in the audience? No? Okay. So if that is the case, thank you very much. Thank you for the people here in the studio and people online. A big thank you for the Committee for the Advancement of Learning and Teaching, CALT, and a big thank you for the panel members, Simone, Blair, and Angela. Thank you very much
Media Productions.
for sharing your experiences, and a big thank you for the media production team for making this broadcast possible.
Yeah.
Ka kite.